In the cold, gray waters of the North Atlantic, just off the coast of Newfoundland, lies a place of rugged beauty and buried secrets. Bell Island, a bastion of iron ore mining for centuries, is home to a story so chilling, so profoundly disturbing, that the Wabana Iron Company sealed the official records for over 50 years. In the brutal winter of 1912, an entire night shift of 47 miners descended into the Scotia number. One mine, a subterranean marvel that stretched for miles beneath the ocean floor. They never came back. The company called it a catastrophic flood, a tragic act of God that left no survivors and no hope of recovery. But recently uncovered documents, a frantic telegraph operator's log, and the fragmented ravings of a single institutionalized survivor paint a far more terrifying picture. They suggest the miners didn't drown in the dark depths. They broke through into something ancient, something that wasn't meant to be found, and in doing so, they unearthed a horror that turned every man against his brother. What they found in the deep didn't just take their lives, it took their souls. Before we descend into the Scotia mine to uncover what really happened to those 47 men, this channel isn't for everyone. It is only for those brave enough to confront the mysteries that history has tried to bury. If you are ready to hear stories that challenge our understanding of reality itself, then hit that subscribe button, because we are about to reveal details that official histories refuse to discuss. And tell us in the comments what state you're listening from, because the darkness that was found beneath the waves in Newfoundland might be closer to your own home than you think. The story begins not with a tragedy, but with a testament to human ambition, the ambition to dig deeper than man was ever meant to go. The Bell Island of 1912 was a world unto itself, a rugged community carved from rock and sea, its entire existence tethered to the iron heart, beating deep within its core. The Wabana Iron Company was more than an employer. It was a kingdom, and the miners were its subjects. They were a special breed of men, drawn from Newfoundland, Scotland, and Ireland, men who understood the bargain they made each day. They would trade the sun and sky for the black, claustrophobic press of the earth in exchange for a wage that could feed their families through the bone-chilling winters. Their domain was the Scotia number, one mine, a feat of engineering that was both a marvel and a monster. It was a submarine mine, its tunnels plunging from the island and extending for miles out under the cold, crushing weight of the Atlantic Ocean. The miners worked in a world where the only light came from their carbide lamps, and the only sounds were the drip of salt water seeping through the rock ceiling, the rhythmic clang of pickaxes, and the constant, unnerving groan of the earth settling. Around them, the night shift of February 15th, 1912, was like any other. 47 men, their faces already smudged with ore dust, gathered at the mine head, their breath pluming in the frigid air. They were led by foreman Angus MacLeod, a giant of a man with a beard the color of rust and hands like granite. MacLeod had spent 20 years in the deep, and he knew the Scotia mine better than he knew his own wife's face. He was a fair but demanding leader, respected for his calm in the face of the mine's many dangers, rockfalls, gas pockets, and the constant gnawing fear of the ocean breaking through. Among his crew were men who embodied the soul of the island. There was Finn O'Connell, a devoutly religious man from Cork, who saw God's judgment in every shadow and whispered prayers as he worked, his rosary beads clicking softly against his tools. He was deeply superstitious, a trait common among men who spent their lives tempting fate in the dark. In stark contrast was Ewan MacDonald, a fresh-faced lad of 17 on only his third deep mine shift. His eyes, not yet dulled by years of dust and darkness, still held a flicker of youthful awe for the great undertaking. He looked up to MacLeod with a mixture of fear and admiration, desperate to prove himself worthy of the title of Iron Man. The other 44 men were a collection of fathers, sons, and brothers, hard men for a hard life, bound together by the shared danger of their profession. They trusted MacLeod with their lives, and MacLeod in turn trusted the mine, or at least he understood its treacherous nature. As they descended in the rickety cage, the familiar scent of damp earth, blasting powder, and human sweat enveloped them. The pinpricks of light from their lamps danced against the wet rock walls, illuminating the massive timber supports that groaned under the weight of the ocean above. Their destination was the number 4 incline, the newest and deepest section of the mine, a place nearly 3 miles from the coast, where the ceiling of rock separating them from the icy Atlantic was at its thinnest. The work was grueling, the air thick and heavy, but for these men it was just another night, another shift wrestling iron from the Earth's grasp, another 8 hours spent in a man-made hell with the hope of seeing the pale Newfoundland sunrise. They had no way of knowing that for every single one of them, it would be the last sunrise they would ever miss. On the surface, in a small, drafty shack near the mine head, Thomas Abernathy sat hunched over his telegraph key. At 68, Thomas was a relic, a man whose hands were too gnarled by arthritis for the mines, but whose mind was still sharp enough to manage the vital communication link to the crews below. Still sharp enough. The system was primitive, a simple telegraph line that ran the length of the main tunnel, allowing the foreman to tap out coded messages, reports on progress, requests for supplies, and, in the worst of times, the 3 frantic taps of an SOS. For the first few hours of the shift, the line was quiet, as expected. MacLeod's crew was known for its efficiency. They worked and only reported when necessary. Around 2 a.m., a routine message came through. MacLeod, tapping with his usual steady rhythm, reported they had reached the end of the number 4 incline and were preparing to set the next round of blasting charges. Thomas logged the message and poured himself another cup of tepid tea. An hour later, a second message arrived, but this one was different. MacLeod's tapping was faster, almost excited. Unusual formation. Vein opens into cavity. Standing by. Will investigate. Thomas frowned. A cavity wasn't unheard of, but it was always a cause for alarm, a potential weakness that could lead to a collapse or a flood. He tapped back a query. Flood risk? Confirm. The reply was slow in coming. When it did, it was disjointed. Negative. DRY. Strange. A light. Thomas squinted at his logbook. A light? It made no sense. He queried again, but for nearly 30 minutes the line was silent. Then it came alive with a burst of frantic, nonsensical tapping. It wasn't code. It was a chaotic jumble of dots and dashes, as if someone was striking the key in a panic. Thomas could make out fragments of letters, M, N, G, L, W, but no coherent words. It sounded like an argument, with different rhythms interrupting each other. He tapped a frantic demand for clarification, his arthritic fingers flying across the key. Report status. Repeat. Report status. Is Foreman MacLeod on the wire? The response was a single chilling series of taps, repeated 3 times, slow and deliberate, like a tolling bell. Not men. Then, the line went dead. Thomas tried for an hour to re-establish contact, but there was only silence. He reported the communication failure to the on-duty shift manager, a stern company man named Blackwood. Thomas relayed the strange messages, the cavity, the light, the final terrifying transmission. Blackwood listened with a stony expression, then dismissed Thomas's concerns. It's a line break, old man, he said curtly. Probably a rockfall. Go home. We'll handle it. But Thomas knew it wasn't a line break. A break was silence. This had been something else, something active and hostile. The next morning, the Wabana Iron Company announced the tragedy. A sudden catastrophic flood, they claimed, had inundated the number 4 incline. The The pressure of the Atlantic, miles above, had finally breached the rock, filling the tunnel in seconds. There were no survivors. For safety reasons, the company announced, the entire Scotia number. One mine would be permanently sealed. Concrete and rock were poured into the entrance, entombing the 47 men forever. The families grieved, accepting the company's explanation as another brutal reality of their life on Belle Island. But Thomas Abernathy knew the truth was far more complex. A flood was a force of nature. What he had heard on the wire that night was not nature. It was the sound of human reason coming apart at the seams, a chorus of madness tapped out from 3 miles beneath the waves. Deep beneath the gray chop of the Atlantic, the air in the number 4 incline was thick with the metallic tang of iron ore and the sweat of 47 men. Foreman Angus MacLeod surveyed the rock face at the end of the tunnel, his carbide lamp casting long, dancing shadows. The crew had just finished setting the blasting charges, a routine they had performed thousands of times. Ewan MacDonald, the rookie, worked with a nervous energy, his movements quick and eager, while Finn O'Connell murmured a prayer for protection, his hand instinctively touching the crucifix he wore around his neck. "All right, lads, stand clear," MacLeod's voice boomed, echoing down the narrow passage. The men retreated to a safe distance, huddling in an alcove as the foreman connected the detonator wires. The blast was muffled by the sheer mass of rock around them, a deep, resonant thump that vibrated through the soles of their boots. After the dust settled, they moved forward, their lamps cutting through the haze to reveal the newly exposed rock. But something was wrong. Instead of a fresh wall of iron-rich stone, they were met with a gaping blackness. The blast hadn't just fractured the rock, it had punched through it. A wave of cold, clean air, impossibly fresh for the deep mine, washed over them. It carried a strange, sweet scent, like damp earth and night-blooming flowers. MacLeod, his instincts screaming caution, held his crew back. "Hold your positions. Check the supports. Finn, test the air for gas." But there was no gas. The air was breathable, almost invigorating. Cautiously, MacLeod edged forward, his lamp held high. The opening was immense, a natural archway leading into a cavern of impossible scale. As the other miners followed, their lamps combined to illuminate a scene that defied all logic. They were standing at the edge of a vast geode, a subterranean cathedral whose walls were not made of dull rock, but were lined with crystalline structures that shimmered and pulsed with their own internal light. A soft, phosphorescent glow, ranging from a pale, ghostly green to a deep, mesmerizing violet, emanated from every surface. The light was cast by a strange, velvety fungus that grew in intricate fractal patterns across the crystals. It clung to the walls, the ceiling, and the floor, bathing the entire cavern in an ethereal, silent luminescence. The men stood in stunned silence, their hard, grimy faces bathed in the otherworldly glow. After months, even years, spent in the oppressive, man-made darkness, this was a revelation. It was beautiful, terrifying, and utterly alien. "Saints preserve us," Finn O'Connell whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of awe and fear. It's the Garden of Eden." Ewan, the rookie, was speechless, his mouth agape as he stared at the glowing spectacle. He reached out a trembling hand to touch one of the pulsating fungi, but MacLeod smacked it away. "Don't touch anything. Fungi. We don't know what this is." But his words of caution were lost in the crew's collective gasp of wonder. They had spent their lives digging for black iron in the dark. They had found a cavern of light. Some of the men laughed, their voices echoing strangely in the vast space. They believed they had stumbled upon a fortune, a new kind of mineral, a cavern of priceless gems. Greed and wonder quickly overrode caution. MacLeod tried to establish a perimeter to keep the men from venturing too deep, but it was like trying to hold back a tide. The sweet cloying scent of the fungus filled their lungs, and the soft, ever-shifting light seemed to pull them forward, deeper into the cavern. MacLeod, feeling his authority slip, made his way back to the telegraph key. "Unusual formation," he tapped, his own sense of wonder warring with a deep, primal unease. "Vein opens into cavity. Standing by. Will investigate." He knew he should order a full retreat, but the sight of the glowing cavern was intoxicating. What had they found? And more importantly, what had they just released into the stagnant air of the mine? The initial fear and caution dissolved into a strange, giddy euphoria. The air in the cavern, thick with the sweet scent of the phosphorescent fungus, seemed to have an intoxicating effect on the crew. The grinding fatigue of their shift melted away, replaced by a surge of energy and a sense of profound well-being. The men, who minutes before had been grim-faced laborers, now behaved like schoolboys on holiday. They laughed, their voices echoing in the vast, glowing space. They pointed out strange crystal formations and patterns in the velvety fungus that resembled faces, animals, and landscapes from a dream. Ewan MacDonald, the young rookie, was completely captivated. He ran from one glowing wall to another, tracing the shifting patterns of light with his grimy fingers, his earlier anxieties about the dangerous work forgotten. "Look, Angus," he shouted to the foreman, his voice filled with childlike wonder. "This one looks like a ship on the waves." Foreman MacLeod felt the intoxicating pull as well, but his years of experience in the deep fought against it. A part of him felt a deep, gnawing wrongness about this place. The air was too sweet, the light too hypnotic. He ordered 2 of his most trusted men, grizzled veterans named Cormac and Dougal, to stay at the entrance and secure the passage back to the main tunnel. "Nobody goes past this point until we know what we're dealing with," MacLeod commanded, his voice lacking its usual iron authority. "And for God's sake, keep your lamps on. I don't trust this light." Finn O'Connell, however, saw the cavern not as a geological anomaly, but as a divine miracle. He fell to his knees, his face upturned to the glowing ceiling, his lips moving in silent, ecstatic prayer. "He's led us here," Finn declared to the men who gathered around him. "Through the dark and the toil, he's brought us to a holy place. This is a sign, a reward for our faith." His words resonated with many of the miners who came from deeply religious backgrounds. The idea that their hard, dangerous lives had a divine purpose, that this discovery was a blessing, was a comforting and powerful notion. They began to see the cavern through Finn's eyes, not as a dangerous, unknown space, but as a subterranean sanctuary. The spores of the fungus, invisible in the glowing air, were now deep in their lungs, beginning their subtle, insidious work on the miners' minds. The euphoria intensified. Men began sharing stories, singing old sea shanties, their voices filling the cavern with a strange, joyous cacophony. The bonds of crew discipline, forged in shared hardship, were loosening, replaced by an unnerving, almost manic camaraderie. MacLeod felt a growing sense of alarm. He saw the glazed look in his men's eyes, the way their laughter was pitched just a little too high. He tried to rally them, to remind them of their duty and the dangers of the mine. "All right, lads, the show's over. We need to report this to the surface and get back to the tunnel. Now!" But his orders were met with grumbles and dismissive waves. "Just a few more minutes, Angus," one miner slurred, his words thick as if he'd been drinking. "It's paradise down here." MacLeod knew he was losing control. He returned to the telegraph key, his mind struggling for the right words. How could he describe this place? How could he convey the strange mix of beauty and menace? He tapped out the message to Thomas Abernathy on the surface. Negative, dry, strange, a light. It was the best he could do. As he turned back to his crew, he saw that several men, led by Ewan, had disobeyed his orders and wandered deeper into the cavern, their carbide lamps now extinguished as they surrendered completely to the fungal glow. They were like moths drawn to a flame, and MacLeod felt a cold dread creep into his heart. He was their foreman, responsible for their lives. But how could he protect them from a paradise that felt more dangerous than any rockfall? The walls seemed to be humming now, a low, resonant frequency that he felt in his bones, and the sweet air tasted of lies. The shift from euphoria to paranoia was as subtle as it was swift. It began with the light. The glowing patterns on the cavern walls, which had at first seemed random and beautiful, began to take on a more deliberate, menacing quality. The miners started seeing things in the shifting luminescence, twisted, leering faces, serpentine shapes that coiled and uncoiled in their peripheral vision, and dark, fleeting figures that seemed to dart just at the edge of the glow. The sweet floral scent of the fungus grew heavier, more cloying, and with it came a change in the air's effect. The giddiness was replaced by a creeping anxiety, a sense of being watched by a million unseen eyes. Anxiety. Minor disagreements, normal among a crew working in close quarters, now flared into hostile confrontations. A miner who accidentally bumped another was met with a snarl and an accusation of a deliberate shove. A shared piece of hardtack was snatched away with a paranoid cry of, "You're trying to poison me!" Finn O'Connell's religious ecstasy curdled into abject terror. The divine light he had celebrated now seemed to him the baleful glare of hell itself. He scrambled back toward the tunnel entrance, his face a mask of horror, pointing a trembling finger at the glowing walls. "They're not angels," he shrieked, his voice cracking. "They're demons. We've breached the walls of perdition. Can't you see their eyes? They're watching us, judging us." His panic was infectious. The men who had been mesmerized by the cavern's beauty now saw it as a trap. The awe was replaced by a primal, claustrophobic fear. They were miles from the surface, miles out under the ocean, in a glowing tomb that seemed to be alive and malevolent. Foreman MacLeod tried to restore order, his voice a bellowing roar against the rising tide of fear. "Pull yourselves together. It's the air. It's playing tricks on our minds. We need to get back to the tunnel, back to fresh air." But his men were no longer his crew. They were a collection of terrified, isolated individuals, each lost in his own private nightmare. The hallucinations became more vivid, more personal. One miner, whose son had died of fever the previous year, saw the boy's ghostly figure beckoning him from deeper within the cavern, and he ran sobbing into the glowing darkness, ignoring MacLeod's commands. Another man, who had a long-standing feud with a crewmate over a woman, now saw his rival's face contorted into a demonic sneer, his eyes burning with malevolent intent. He picked up a geology hammer, his knuckles white. The trust that had bound them together shattered. Every man became an island of fear, seeing betrayal and threat in the eyes of his comrades. They began to huddle in small, suspicious groups, whispering about the others. "Did you see the way Cormac looked at me?" one miner hissed. "He's one of them. The light has taken him." Back at the telegraph key, a desperate struggle was unfolding. Several miners, in their panicked state, believed the communication line was a conduit for the evil in the cavern to reach the surface. They tried to smash it. MacLeod and a few others who still clung to a shred of sanity fought to protect it, their only link to the outside world. It was during this chaotic struggle that the garbled messages were tapped out. A jumble of letters and rhythms as different hands grabbed for the key, each trying to send their own panicked, incoherent warning. The message "not men" was tapped out by Finn in a moment of crazed lucidity as he looked at his crewmates and saw not the familiar faces of his friends, but the twisted, monstrous visages of demons wearing their skin. The walls themselves seemed to be whispering now, the low hum rising in pitch, weaving a symphony of madness that echoed the miners' own unraveling minds. Foreman Angus MacLeod was fighting a war on two fronts. One was against the burgeoning madness of his crew, and the other was against the insidious treason of his own mind. The glowing cavern walls were no longer just a backdrop to the chaos. They were an active participant. In the shifting violet and green light, MacLeod saw his younger brother, Liam, who had died in a mining accident a decade earlier. Liam's ghostly form stood among the crystals, his face a mask of sorrowful accusation. "You left me, Angus," the phantom whispered, his voice sounding like grinding rock. "You left me to die in the dark. Now you'll stay here with us." MacLeod shook his head, trying to clear the vision, but Liam's image was burned into his retinas. He knew it wasn't real, but the guilt it dredged up was potent, clouding his judgment and sapping his will to fight. He saw the same struggle in the eyes of his men. They were no longer fighting each other over perceived slights. They were fighting phantoms. Men swung pickaxes at empty shadows, screamed warnings at the glowing walls, and clawed at their own faces to shut out the terrible visions. The cavern had become a Boschian hellscape, a pandemonium of light, shadow, and shrieks of terror. The violence, once sporadic, became a full-blown melee. In the eerie, sourceless light, it was impossible to tell friend from foe. Every man saw his deepest fears made manifest in the faces of his crewmates. A father of 5, convinced his comrades were demons sent to drag him to hell, used a steel pry bar to beat 2 men to death, all while sobbing his children's names. Ewan, the young rookie, had curled into a ball in a small crevice, his hands clamped over his ears, his body shaking uncontrollably. He watched in wide-eyed horror as men he had shared bread with just hours before tore each other apart with the tools of their trade. Finn O'Connell, his mind completely shattered, had fashioned a crude cross from 2 pieces of splintered timber. He stood on a high ledge, no longer preaching damnation, but laughing, a high, unhinged cackle that was perhaps the most terrifying sound in the cavern. "The feast of light has begun," he screamed. "Give your flesh to the walls. Let them consume your sin." MacLeod made one last, desperate attempt to regain control. He fired his signal pistol into the air. The loud crack and the bright flash of the flare momentarily stunned the men, cutting through the hallucinatory haze. For a brief, blessed moment, he had their attention. "To the tunnel," he bellowed, his voice raw. "Now! Follow me." He grabbed the 2 nearest men, both bleeding from head wounds, and began dragging them toward the mine shaft. For a second, it seemed to work. A handful of miners, their eyes clearing with a flicker of recognition, started to follow him. But the respite was short-lived. The hum of the cavern intensified, and the light pulsed with a new, aggressive rhythm. The phantoms returned, more vivid and terrifying than before. The men who had started to follow MacLeod screamed and turned back, swinging their tools not at each other now, but at the foreman himself, seeing him as the demonic leader of their tormentors. MacLeod was forced to let go of the men he was saving and defend himself. His last act of sanity was a desperate lunge for the telegraph key. As the first pickaxe blow struck his shoulder, he managed to tap out a final, frantic rhythm, not a code, not a word, but a primal beat of pure terror that hammered against the silence until a second blow silenced it, and him, forever. The line went dead, and in the deep, the feast of light continued until only silence and the soft, patient glow of the fungus remained. For 60 years, the story of the Scotia number. One mine remained sealed in company ledgers and the collective grieving memory of Bell Island. The 47 men were memorialized on a stone plaque, their names a testament to the dangers of the sea and the earth, their deaths officially attributed to a sudden, unpreventable flood. The mine entrance, a great scar on the coast, was plugged with tons of rock and concrete, a permanent tombstone for the lost crew. The tale became a local legend, a ghost story told to children to warn them away from the treacherous coastline. But in the autumn of 1972, the legend clawed its way back into reality. A group of teenagers exploring the remote coastline near the sealed mine entrance stumbled upon a figure huddled in a sea cave. He was a man, though barely recognizable as such, ancient and skeletal, his hair and beard a wild matted tangle of white. He was dressed in the tattered remains of oilskins that seemed to have fused to his skin, and his eyes, when he looked up at them, were pale, terrified pools of madness. Authorities were called, and the man was taken to the psychiatric hospital in St. John's. He was incoherent, his speech a jumbled litany of rock and light and blood. It took weeks of patient work and a search through old records before he was identified. Fingerprints taken from a military enlistment record from 1911 confirmed the impossible. The man was Ewan MacDonald, the 17-year-old rookie from the lost night shift of February 15th, 1912. He was now 77 years old. His reappearance was a medical and historical impossibility. No one could survive for 60 years in a sealed, flooded mine. The Wabana Company, now a different entity, dismissed it as a case of mistaken identity or a cruel hoax. But Ewan's doctors, while certifying him as profoundly mentally ill, were certain of his identity. Over the next several months, a psychiatrist, Dr. Alistair Finch, worked with Ewan, patiently piecing together the fragmented shards of his memory. What emerged was not the story of a flood, but a narrative of hallucinatory horror that defied rational explanation. Ewan's account, documented in Dr. Finch's now declassified notes, was a rambling, terrifying epic. He spoke of the glowing cavern, a paradise with poison in the air, he called it. He described how the beautiful, shifting light had turned his crewmates into monsters. "They weren't men anymore, Doctor," he whispered during one session, his hands trembling. "Their faces, they twisted. They had the faces of the men, but their eyes were full of light, a hungry light. They were the men who weren't men." He recounted the violence in chilling, disjointed detail, the screams, the sickening crunch of tools on bone, the maniacal laughter of Finn O'Connell, who he claimed had danced as the others fought and died. He told Dr. Finch that he had only survived by crawling into a narrow fissure in the rock, a space too small for the others to follow. From his hiding place, he had watched the slaughter unfold in the eerie, pulsating glow. He watched until the last man fell and the cavern grew silent, save for the low, triumphant hum of the glowing walls. He never explained how he had survived for 60 years. He spoke of eating the glowing moss and drinking the sweet water that dripped from the stone. But his descriptions were those of a man lost in a permanent nightmare, not a coherent survivor's tale. He insisted the mine wasn't flooded, that the company had lied. "They didn't seal the water in," he repeated over and over. "They sealed the light in." Ewan MacDonald lived for 2 more years in the hospital, never regaining his sanity. His story was dismissed as the tragic fantasy of a man whose mind had been broken by an unknown trauma, a footnote to the official history of the Belle Island disaster. Ewan MacDonald's impossible reappearance and his mad tale might have been forgotten, just another piece of strange local folklore, had it not been for a young, curious historian named Evelyn Reed in the early 1980s. Researching a book on Newfoundland mining disasters, she gained access to the recently unsealed Wabana Company archives. There she found the Scotia number, one incident file. While the official report detailed the flood, Reed discovered a series of memos that told a different story. They documented the company's private debate in the days following the disaster. Geologists had reported no seismic activity consistent with a tunnel collapse of that magnitude. Engineers noted that the mine's pumps should have been able to handle even a significant breach, yet they had never been activated. Most damning of all was a heavily redacted addendum containing the full log from the telegraph operator, Thomas Abernathy. His account of the strange messages, the light, the chaotic tapping, the final chilling "not men," had been deliberately suppressed. Reed then cross-referenced this with Dr. Finch's notes from his sessions with Ewan MacDonald. The parallels were undeniable. Ewan's ravings about glowing walls and men who weren't men lined up perfectly with the miner's final panicked transmissions. The company hadn't sealed the mine because of a flood. They had sealed it because they had received a report so bizarre, so terrifying, that they chose to entomb 47 men rather than risk whatever they had found from reaching the surface. The official story was a cover-up, a desperate act of containment. What truly lay in the deep off Bell Island? A geological anomaly that produces hallucinogenic spores, an unknown bioluminescent organism with psychotropic properties. Or was it something more, something ancient and sentient, as Ewan's maddened whispers seemed to suggest? The questions linger, unanswered, in the sealed and silent depths. The Scotia number. One mine remains a concrete and rock plug against the Atlantic, a permanent memorial to a lie. The truth is buried with the 47 men who dug too deep, and with the one man who survived only to be lost in a labyrinth of his own mind. But the story doesn't quite end there. Even today, on the darkest nights when the tide is low and the air is still, fishermen sailing off the coast of Bell Island sometimes report a strange phenomenon. A faint, ethereal glow that seems to pulse from deep beneath the waves in the precise location of the number 4 incline. They say it looks like the aurora borealis, trapped under the water. Most dismiss it as a trick of the light, a reflection of the stars on the cold, black sea. But those who know the story of the lost crew of Scotia Mine, those who have heard the whispers of the ghost of Ewan MacDonald, they know better. They pull up their nets, turn their boats toward the shore, and say a prayer for the souls lost in the dark, forever trapped in the hungry, glowing walls they unearthed beneath the waves.